Most men think attraction is something you earn by doing more, talking more, proving more, explaining more. But psychology shows something uncomfortable. The more you try to be liked, the more your perceived value actually drops. Not because you're doing something wrong, but because you're broadcasting something invisible, uncertainty in your own worth. And here's where it gets interesting. The shift that changed how women responded to me wasn't about looks, money, or even confidence in the way people usually think of it. It was a subtle internal recalibration that completely changed the way I was seen in every interaction. Same words. Same situations. Different reactions from women I'd known for years. So the real question is, what changes in a man that makes women stop testing him, and start responding differently without even realizing why? Because once you understand this, you don't just change how women see you, you change how everyone does. In the next few minutes, you're going to understand the exact psychological shift that alters perception at a fundamental level. We're going to break down how attraction is actually formed in the mind, not through pickup tactics, but through identity signals, subtle behaviors that communicate who you are before you ever say a word. This is backed by core principles from social psychology, including self-perception theory, emotional contagion, and status signaling. Concepts that explain why people don't respond to your intentions, they respond to your state. And by the end of this, you'll understand why some men walk into a room and change the energy without trying, while others try harder and become less noticeable. Let's go deep. There was a time when every conversation felt like I was being evaluated. I'd over-explain jokes, over-justify opinions, and unconsciously wait for approval in the form of laughter, agreement, or attention. And strangely, the more I tried to get it right, the more distant interactions felt. Then something shifted. Not dramatically. No mindset quote moment. Just a slow internal withdrawal from needing a reaction. Psychologically, this connects to self-determination theory. Humans can unconsciously detect when someone is outcome dependent, meaning their behavior changes based on approval. And that dependency lowers perceived social value. When you stop seeking validation, your communication becomes clean. You speak without anticipating approval. You pause without filling silence. You disagree without softening your stance just to stay liked. And here's the shift women notice: you stop performing for the outcome, and start existing in the moment. That creates something rare: certainty without aggression. Presence without effort. And that is where perception begins to change. Because people don't trust what is trying to convince them, they trust what is already comfortable being itself. And once that shift begins, everything else starts stacking on top of it. A friend once told me something interesting. He said, "You don't react to things the way most men do anymore." At first, I didn't understand what he meant. But then I started noticing it in interactions. Small provocations didn't pull me into emotional escalation. Silence didn't trigger insecurity. Even subtle teasing didn't demand a response. This connects directly to emotional contagion. People unconsciously mirror emotional states. If you react strongly, you invite intensity back. If you stay grounded, the environment stabilizes around you. Now here's where attraction psychology becomes important. Emotional reactivity signals instability. Not in a dramatic sense, but in a predictive sense. The brain categorizes reactive behavior as lower control. When you remain calm, especially in moments where reaction is expected, something subtle happens in perception: you become harder to read. And what is harder to read becomes more cognitively engaging. But more importantly, it creates psychological safety. And safety is one of the most underestimated components of attraction. Not excitement. Not mystery. Safety. Because when a woman feels emotionally safe around you, she lowers internal defenses. And when defenses drop, perception shifts from evaluation to curiosity. That is when you stop being another guy and start becoming a reference point in her mind. And this is where most men accidentally sabotage everything without realizing it. There's a moment most men don't recognize. It happens when they overinvest attention too early. Constant replies. Immediate availability. Always present. Always accessible. At first, it seems like effort. But psychologically, it creates something else, reduced perceived value. Not because attention is bad, but because unrestricted attention removes contrast. And without contrast, nothing feels significant. This is explained through basic reinforcement principles in behavioral psychology. When attention is abundant and predictable, it loses motivational weight. But when attention becomes selective, not inconsistent, just intentional, it gains meaning. I learned this shift accidentally. I stopped reacting instantly. Not to play games, but because I became more focused on my own life structure. And suddenly, the same conversations changed tone. People leaned in more. Engagement increased without effort. Here's what was really happening: my attention stopped signaling neediness and started signaling choice. And choice is interpreted as value. Because if someone has control over where their attention goes, it implies they have something worth protecting. But here's the important distinction: this is not about withholding affection. It's about removing compulsive availability. You're no longer trying to be chosen. You're operating as someone who also chooses. And that changes the entire dynamic of attraction without a single word being said. Let me ask you something directly. If attraction was just about being nice, available, and consistent, then why do those traits so often lead to being overlooked? Because attraction isn't built on predictability alone. It's built on interpretation gaps. The space between what someone expects and what you actually do. And most men never realize they are training people to expect too much access and too little mystery. That changes everything about how you move from here. One of the most powerful shifts I ever made was simple. I stopped over-explaining decisions. Not in a cold or dismissive way, but in a calm, grounded way. I can't make it. I'm not into that. That doesn't work for me. No long justification. No emotional cushioning. At first, it felt uncomfortable. Like something was missing. But over time, something interesting happened. People started accepting my words at face value. This connects to cognitive consistency theory. When your communication is direct and non-defensive, it reduces ambiguity. And when ambiguity drops, perceived authority rises. Because over-explaining does something subtle, it signals that your decision requires external approval to be valid. But when you state things cleanly, without justification, you create internal coherence. Your words match your identity without needing reinforcement. And people unconsciously respect coherence. Especially women. Because coherence signals stability. And stability signals emotional reliability. But there's another layer here. When you stop explaining yourself, you also stop inviting negotiation where none is needed. And that changes how boundaries are perceived, not as something fragile, but as something fixed. And once boundaries become felt instead of explained, respect changes instantly. There's a paradox most men never understand. The most attractive men are not unpredictable emotionally. They are steady. Grounded. Calm. But they are unpredictable in direction. You don't know exactly what they'll choose, how they'll prioritize, or where they'll invest energy next. That combination is powerful. Because emotional predictability creates safety. But behavioral unpredictability creates curiosity. Psychologically, this taps into reward anticipation systems in the brain. When outcomes are not fully predictable, attention increases. But when emotional stability is present, anxiety does not rise. So you get a rare combination, comfort and intrigue in the same person. This is where perception locks in differently. You're no longer interpreted as reactive or needy. You're interpreted as stable, but not accessible on demand. And that subtle difference changes how effort is made toward you. Because people invest more energy into what they cannot fully map. And that is where attraction stops being something you chase, and starts becoming something that responds to you. At the deepest level, none of this is really about women. It's about identity. Because what changes how others see you is never your behavior in isolation, it's the internal agreement you have with yourself about who you are. When you stop seeking validation, you stop negotiating your worth. When you regulate emotion, you stop leaking uncertainty. When you control attention, you stop broadcasting need. When you stop over-explaining, you stop inviting doubt into your own decisions. And slowly, people stop interacting with a version of you that is trying to be accepted, and start interacting with a version of you that already accepts itself. That is the real shift. Not dominance. Not manipulation. Not performance. But alignment. Because when your internal state becomes stable enough, perception around you has no choice but to reorganize itself. You don't force attraction. You remove the behaviors that were blocking it. And what's left is something far more powerful than approval. It's presence that doesn't ask to be understood, but naturally is. If this resonated with you, don't just move on from it. Pay attention to where in your life you still feel the need to explain, prove, or chase approval. That's usually where the shift hasn't fully landed yet. I'm curious, what part of this hit you the hardest? The validation, the emotional control, or the attention shift? Share it in the comments. I read them. And in the next video, we'll go even deeper into something most men never notice, why emotional control alone isn't enough without identity consistency, and how that silently decides the quality of every relationship you enter. Because once you see this pattern clearly, you don't go back to the old way of moving through people. You start moving differently through life itself.